Hello and welcome back to the Advanced English podcast by I Speak English. I'm Hayley and today I'm going to be talking about a topic that's full of complexity and nuance and one that's quite close to home for me, which is immigration and identity, with a special focus on British immigration and emigration. As usual, you can download the transcript and vocabulary list from the link in the description, and I won't be slowing down my speech since this podcast is made with advanced and proficient learners in mind. If you feel like I'm talking too fast for you, you can slow down the speed of this video in the settings. Otherwise, this podcast might not be for you if you can't quite understand what I'm saying. Again, it's for advanced and proficient learners. So in this episode, we're going to explore how immigration is a natural phenomenon, and we're going to take a look at the waves of migration to the UK, why people emigrate, and struggles of assimilation, as well as identity loss and confusion. We're also going to take a look at second-generation immigrants and how they navigate their identity, and the difference between an immigrant and an expat, as well as looking at negative attitudes and, of course, the many benefits that immigration brings. So this one is quite close to my heart because I am an immigrant myself and I have been for over 10 years now. Immigration is a very complex topic, so if you're ready, we're going to get into it. So let's crack on. So to kick off, let's remind ourselves that immigration is nothing new. It's as natural as breathing. Humans have been moving from place to place since time immemorial, from ancient trade routes to empire expansions, to trade, conquest, famine, and obviously opportunity as well. One of the earliest written records actually of immigration dates back to over 3000 BC in Mesopotamia, and it shows evidence of people migrating due to trade and famine. And there's also some tablets from Sumeria which mention people moving in different cities of surrounding areas as well. Sumeria was an ancient civilization which predates the Egyptians. So you might say that migration's as old as civilization itself, really. I mean, the Romans, they moved across Europe. The Vikings, they sailed far and wide. The British themselves emigrated in waves to Ireland, to the Americas, to Australia. So when people talk about immigration as though it's a recent problem, let's say, in quotation marks, that's, it's a bit misleading, really. Even in the UK, people have always come to the UK. We had the Anglo-Saxons from continental Europe. We had the Normans, the Huguenots, the Jewish immigrations fleeing persecution. We had Caribbean migration after World War II, Southeast Asian arrival during decolonial shifts. And then the list just goes on and on. So migration, it ebbs and flows, but it never really disappears. And we only need to look at the English language itself to see the influence of immigration and its patchwork structures. You've got Latin, you've got a bit of Norse, French, Celtic. English itself is just, a kind of hodgepodge of different languages all melted together in one. Every time a group moved to Britain, they brought different words, different accents, as well as culture. So it's no shock, really, that immigration and identity always tend to mix, meld, and sometimes even clash. But that mixing is what kind of makes identity dynamic, not static. And so that's our starting point. Immigration is natural. The challenge is how people adapt and integrate and how societies respond. So before we get into all of that, first of all, let's take a look at some history. We're going to walk back through key waves of immigration in the UK, and that will give us some historical context to understanding different current debates. So the earliest immigrants to the UK were prehistoric settlers after the Ice Age around 8000 BC. They're likely crossing from continental Europe. Then you had the Celts, then you had the Romans in 43 AD, the Anglo-Saxons in the 5th century, the Vikings from the 8th to 11th century, and the Normans in 1066. Now, if we look a bit closer in time, we take a look at post-World War II and the Windrush generation. So after World War II, Britain urgently needed labour to rebuild. And the British Nationality Act in 1948 gave people from the Commonwealth the right to come and settle. So Caribbean immigrants, or the Windrush generation as they're known, came in big numbers in the late 1940s and 50s, and they worked in public services, transport, housing and healthcare. But unfortunately they faced massive discrimination despite helping to rebuild Britain and essentially laying the groundwork for the multicultural Britain that we know today. Moving on to the 1950s, 60s and 70s, we had South Asian migration, so people from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh moved to the UK. Some of them took up jobs in mills and factories and public sectors. Particularly after the partition of India, migrant streams were quite strong, and generally their communities, they tend to settle in more urban areas like Birmingham, Bradford, Manchester and suburbs of London. After that, if we're moving on to the 60s and 70s, we had East African Asians, so Asians from Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, many of Indian origin, were kind of expelled or often felt unsafe in those countries, and they were accepted in the UK, particularly if they held British passports or had links to the UK, and that kind of bolstered British Asian communities a bit more. And then moving further on, if we look quite a bit closer, after the EU expanded in 2004, many people from Poland, Lithuania, Romania, Latvia also moved to the UK, and they often found work in construction or agriculture, hospitality services. And this wave was particularly noticeable because migrants weren't coming from former colonial connections, they were coming from within Europe this time. So that was quite a big wave back then, about 20 years ago. And more recently, if we take a look at the kind of last wave, which is more refugees and asylum seekers, the UK has accepted refugees, not as many as other countries, but particularly from areas that are involved in conflict, like the Middle East, Syria, Afghanistan, some countries in Africa. And this has added a different dimension now to EU immigration, which is forced migration. These people are kind of forced to leave their homes, forced to run and go through asylum processes. And often these people do struggle with integrating, usually because they don't really want to be here. They would rather be at home, but they don't have much choice. So each of these waves has kind of brought different demographics and skills and cultural practices, and also some challenges as well. And unfortunately, each wave has also triggered some backlash and debates about integration and identity, and maybe in some cases social strain as well. So many of these cases, though, immigrants have settled, they've even had children, they've become British citizens, they contribute to business and science, and over time these generations tend to blend, but that doesn't mean that the journey is smooth, as we're going to discuss now. So there's always an interesting question to me. I have a lot of students ask me this, actually. They often ask why I left the UK. So I've not lived in the UK for over 10 years. And whenever they ask me this, I guess my answer would just be either boredom or just the urge to be somewhere else and somewhere new. It's funny, I visited Ireland a few years ago with my dad, and we were visiting family there. So my family actually emigrated from Ireland to the UK. So I have some English family, some Welsh family, some Irish family, and some of the Irish family were actually immigrants from Italy. So, I have kind of immigration in my blood, let's say. But we were in Ireland visiting family, and we were in the Migration Museum, and there was a huge sign in one of the exhibitions, and it said, "Why did you leave?" in big letters. And then underneath were all the reasons why people emigrate. So we're going to take a look at those reasons now. I think my reason would have just been opportunity, which is probably not the best reason, but let's say the easiest reason to leave. I think a lot of people believe that it is just that easy, that you just hop on a plane and there you go, you've immigrated and that's it. But in reality, it is much harder than that. Leaving your homeland, your family, everything you know, to go to a completely different country, often where you don't know anybody, you don't have a job, you might not even know the language either. It's an incredibly difficult thing to do, and it's often filled with a lot of uncertainty. So why do people do it? What's pushing them to do it? What's pulling them to do it? So we're going to take a look at some push factors. So why are people pushed or even perhaps forced to emigrate? Economic hardship or poverty or unemployment, they're a huge one and have been again over time. Again, when I looked at my Italian family in the 1870s, it was just when Italy had unified and there was massive poverty in the south of Italy. And I imagine that's why my family left and went to the UK, because they didn't have, they were poor farmers and they didn't really have a good quality of life. Second one is conflict, war. If you're running from war, I think it's a very natural thing to do. If you're in danger, you run. That's what I would do if I was in a war-torn country. I would take my family and run for my life, frankly. And I don't blame anybody that does. Environmental change is a huge one. It's becoming more and more common, I think. If again, you're living somewhere that's flooded every year or has, tornadoes, or again, you're just generally in danger. You would run. Lack of opportunity for education, of course, is another big one. And social exclusion or discrimination could be another one as well. So they're all things that kind of push people to emigrate or force them to emigrate. Now let's look at some pull factors, so some reason why people would want to emigrate. What's kind of the positive thing for them? So better economic prospects, higher wages, better jobs, safety, security. Lots of countries outside the UK are nowhere near as safe or secure. Family reunification, maybe they already have family that are abroad and they want to reunite with them. Educational opportunities. Again, we have a very high standard of education in the UK. And freedom, human rights, social mobility. Again, we have a very high level of freedom compared to a lot of countries in the UK. You can pretty much do whatever you want as long as you're within, basic laws. A lot of countries, they're not that lucky. Particularly women have a lot more rules and regulations on them in quite a few countries, so it's understandable why they would move. So in the UK context, many immigrants historically, they come for jobs, for industrial jobs or public service jobs, and also to escape hardship and persecution in their home countries. Some emigrate because their country's institutions are weak. Some move because they just see opportunity in economy, like myself. And for many people, there is a deeper motive or a deeper aspiration, which is just, to live. People want more than just survival. Surviving isn't living. There's a very big difference. They want their children to have opportunities that they never had. And there's nothing wrong with that. Immigration it's a massive gamble, really. It's a huge leap of faith. You're being torn from your roots. You have to leave behind your culture, your language, often your family as well. And there's massive emotional costs to that, and also identity loss as well. A lot of immigrants, they find, they kind of feel like they're in limbo a lot of the time. And that's where questions of identity come in as well. So when we're talking about identity, you might hear the word assimilation, that immigrants need to assimilate or integrate, let's say. And in this assimilation, it's often both desired and resented. Many newcomers do hope to fit in, but they find a lot of cultural barriers that stop them from fitting in as well as they'd like. So language barriers, for example. Even if immigrants do speak English, which the majority do, local accents, idioms, local slang, fast speech, regional dialects, they all present challenges. So even though you might know textbook English, you would still struggle to keep up in, a market in London or a pub in Birmingham. It's not that easy. Cultural norms is another one which makes it quite difficult to assimilate. Social cues, humour, manners, they're completely different depending on what country you live in or what country you come from. And what's polite in your culture may seem a bit odd in another. So new immigrants, they might inadvertently be breaking these social rules that they didn't even know existed. Especially stuff like, eye contact, the tone, the way in which you speak, body language, personal space is a massive one. I remember when I first moved to Italy, that was a big shock for me with their personal space, or lack of personal space, I should say. People were very touchy-feely there. They kiss you on the face when they meet you. They often put their hands on you, and at first it took me a long time to get used to it. I really didn't like it. But now I'm the same after living in Italy and Spain. I'm often quite touchy with people as well. I need to remember when I go back to the UK to back off a bit and let people have some personal space. So it is difficult, when you come into a new country and you aren't used to the way things are done. It takes a long time to kind of get settled and, just get used to the way things are, really. But I've been quite lucky, really, in terms of immigrating, in that, I've not really come across much discrimination or prejudice at all. Firstly, obviously, it's probably because I'm white British. So if people ask where I'm from and I tell them I'm from England, they automatically have a positive reaction and assume I'm some kind of benefit to their country, or that I'm at least contributing somehow. And secondly, I live in a country where people are generally quite friendly and welcoming, so I've been quite lucky. But sadly, a lot of immigrants do face negative attitudes, stereotyping, xenophobia, microaggression, especially if they're not white. And even if they do assimilate, they might still be seen as like the other, and this tends to create quite a lot of tension. If you kind of try too hard, then you lose your roots and your identity, but if you don't try enough, then you risk being excluded by the host country or people from the host country. So it's a really tricky, a tricky balance to get right. Another reason why immigrants might struggle to assimilate is because of just economic barriers. So often immigrants, they accept jobs that are far below their qualifications, often because their credentials or their diplomas, they don't translate, or they're not recognised by the host country, even though they've spent the same amount of time, studying at university. They're just not recognised. So then they need to take a job that's way below their pay grade or way below their qualifications, and then because of that, they end up facing kind of poor housing, they have low pay, and they're often exploited as well. And then add to that the identity problem as well, where often you kind of feel like you're caught between two different worlds, so you're never fully at home in the new country, or you don't feel fully at home in the new country, and you're not really able to return to your old one. Assimilation is not just a one-way street, and host countries, I think, need to open their doors and just be a bit more welcoming and try to make it easier, I think, as easy as possible to assimilate as they can, really, because it's not an easy situation to be in at all. So I've spoke about identity loss and confusion. This is an interesting one for me. I actually did a thesis on this at university. For my Italian degree, I was looking into Italian immigration and identity. And this has kind of one of the deepest emotional impacts on immigrants when they move. This identity confusion, when you leave your homeland, you kind of lose, you might lose your language if you don't speak it anymore in your host country. You lose, food, all the comforting things that you're used to. You lose your community, even some rituals. And, sometimes I do ask myself this question, like, am I still British? Can I count myself as British? I mean, I still have a British passport, but I don't really feel English anymore. But then again, I don't really feel Spanish. I live in Spain. I wouldn't really say I feel Spanish. I did feel Italian when I lived in Italy. And I only lived there for about 3 years, but I had quite, I had C2 level Italian. I had a lot of Italian friends. I was in the community a lot more. But now, yeah, it's hard, I'd say, oh, well, I'm originally from the UK, but I haven't lived there in so long, I don't really feel it anymore. And I think a lot of immigrants have the same feeling when they've lived so long outside their home country. And they also kind of feel that they have to suppress their heritage in order to fit in, maybe abandon their accent or try and change the way they speak. Change their name even. I also do this myself because people who don't speak English as a native language often struggle to pronounce my name. So just to make it easier for other people, for example, if I'm in the doctor's office or something and I have to fill out a form, I'll usually write my middle name instead of my first name because it's just easier for people to pronounce. But for other people, for other immigrants, this might feel like a bit of a betrayal. Having to change your own name, which is a massive part of your identity. Some people do resist that assimilation. They, cling to their identity, which is fair enough because it's you. But often they are met with suspicion when they do that because, again, it's like, oh, well, you're not assimilating enough. And this tug of war, between different cultures and identities can often lead to alienation and self-doubt, and people might even feel kind of invisible, neither like they're here nor there, and their identity kind of becomes this patchwork of different things. Memory can play a role in identity as well. Childhood memories, family stories, language spoken at home, festivals that you celebrated when you were in your home country. These can really anchor your identity, but second and third generation immigrants, they might lose this because they were never in the home country to begin with. Their home country is the country their parents emigrated to. So they kind of lose this connection, or this connection to home fades. And this transition can kind of be quite messy and often quite painful. So second generation immigrants or children of immigrants born and raised mostly in the host country, they often face unique challenges that their parents don't. They grow up with this dual exposure. They have a home language and home habits and a home religion. And then on the flip side, they have their kind of school habits, they have their peer culture, and they have their national identity. And they might feel like they're in between quite a lot of the time. They're not fully of their parents' country, but they're not fully accepted as natives either. Many of these immigrants speak their home language poorly or not at all. By home language, I mean their parents' home language. And they might adopt an accent of the surrounding area, and, maybe relatives kind of tease them, saying, oh, you sound, very British, let's say that they were born or raised in Britain. And some might even feel pressure to perform, or be more authentic in their home space and then have to adjust their behaviour outside because of the two cultures that are clashing. So you often get this conflict when home expectations clash with the mainstream culture that they're brought up in. Perhaps their parents expect certain, traditions or gender roles or community obligations, but the child is influenced by, modern British norms if they've grown up in Britain. And identity categories, they can be quite fluid. You get British Pakistani, British Caribbean, British African, British Asian. Some people prefer hyphenated identities, others reject the hyphen altogether, and identity becomes this sort of negotiation. Second generation immigrants, or second generation people, I should say, they tend to feel this. They tend to face identity rejection when native British people question their Britishness. You know, they might say, oh, where are you from? And they say, oh, I'm from Liverpool. And I say, yeah, but where are you really from? Despite the fact that that person was born and raised, you know, in the same town as them. And then on the flip side, their immigrant community or their parents' community might see them as too westernized. So they feel like this perpetual outsider. It's a really difficult situation to be in, you know. But there is opportunity there. There's kind of second generation people, they are the bridge between cultures. They bring innovation and they're kind of advocates for inclusion, really. And they often become translators between two cultures. So there is a positive side to it, but it can put you in a very difficult situation. So this leads me to something else that I wanted to talk about, which is the difference between the word immigrant and expat. So you've probably heard this debate. And these labels, immigrant and expat, they do carry connotations. So the word immigrant is often used for people from non-Western countries who, you know, they're looking for permanent settlement. Sometimes they have lower status and they're perceived as needing integration, whereas expat is often used for Westerners or skilled migrants. They're assumed to be temporary and they have higher status and they're expected to integrate less. And that distinction definitely reflects inequality. It's partly about race, partly about class, partly about nationality. Being called an expat often comes with unspoken privilege, whereas being called an immigrant, there is always that added suspicion or stigma to the word. And I've experienced this myself. Now, I am an immigrant, I'm not an expat. An immigrant is someone who leaves their home country to live in a host country, and they retain their citizenship of their home country, like myself. I still have a British passport, I'm still a British citizen, despite not living in Britain for over 10 years. An expat is someone who gives up their citizenship and takes on the new citizenship of the new country. It literally means expatriate. So you are, you know, getting rid of your citizenship, essentially. I haven't done that. Now, what's funny is people often refer to me as an expat, but never as an immigrant. I actually remember when I was living in Italy, and some of my students, they were complaining about immigrants right in front of me. And I asked them if they realised I was an immigrant too, and they were absolutely adamant that I wasn't an immigrant. And that just shows the kind of privilege I'm afforded just because the colour of my skin and what it says on my passport, essentially. You know, in the UK, people from Australia, Canada, and European countries, they're often called expats. But someone from like Nigeria or India, they'll be labelled an immigrant, even if they have the same job or the same income. You know, language really matters, and these labels influence public perception and identity. So many people reject immigrant. Many white people reject the term immigrant, and they prefer things like migrant or resident or expat. But some people reclaim immigrant with pride. But the point is, labels aren't neutral and they do carry power and they should be used correctly. Again, because of this like negative attitude towards immigration. And there is a lot of negative attitude, a lot of hostility, and particularly recently, definitely in the UK, this immigration debate is becoming more emotionally charged every day and politicised. And immigrants are always the scapegoat for everything wrong with the country rather than, you know, the people that are in charge that are messing everything up. But there's some, you know, negative perceptions of immigration. For example, they drain resources. So they're a drain on welfare, on housing, on the national health system. But at the same time, people often say that immigrants take jobs from natives, which I'm not sure how those two things can exist at the same time, how you can take jobs but also be a drain on society at the same time. It doesn't really make any sense. There's also the refusal to assimilate. People think that immigrants don't try not to assimilate and they kind of form like ghettos. You've got this loss of British identity as well, which is a big thing now, again with all these kind of far-right protests and stuff. There's the whole Make Britain Great Again, or whatever it is, the Unite Britain, or whatever bullshit they've come up with, as if, having a Pakistani neighbour can somehow make you less British. I don't understand it. And then the other negative thing that people often talk about is kind of security or crime or terrorism. And these perceptions, they're often heavily exaggerated or based on anecdotes, and research repeatedly shows that they're myths or they're blown out of proportion. And the reason this is used is just scapegoating. Whenever there's times of economic stress, immigrants are always blamed for unemployment or wage stagnation, and politicians always exploit these fears. Again, they use our services and they don't pay their own way, which couldn't be further from the truth. One of the most visible contributions of immigrants in the UK is in the healthcare sector, particularly in the NHS. I've done a bit of research, and in June 2023, this comes from the NHS board.gov website. In June 2023, 265,000 NHS staff in England, that's out of 1.5 million, reportedly were non-British nationals. So 1 in 5 NHS workers are foreign nationals. So if we were to say no more immigration and kick out every single immigrant in the UK, we would lose a fifth of NHS workers, of doctors and nurses, which we cannot afford to lose because the NHS is already very much understaffed as it is. So, it's stuff like this negative scapegoating that gets really blown out of proportion, and then that leads to the public attitudes changing as well, becoming negative. That can lead to hate crime, it can lead to bullying. Despite the fact that in a lot of British towns, immigrant communities reside pretty peacefully with local communities, and you also benefit from cultural diversity, new businesses, new food. I'd say the counter to this negativity is just education and open dialogue. Actually listen to people. When you meet migrants, ask them about their stories, listen to them, and then the demonization that they face, hopefully it will fade. So now let's take a look at the good bits. I talked about the bad side. Let's take a look at the good side of what immigration brings, because there's loads of goodness that it brings. First of all, economic growth. Immigrants, they often fill labour gaps. They do take the jobs, but not take, without warrant. If an immigrant who can't speak your language is able to get a job and you're not, I think something's, wrong with you rather than the immigrants. But immigrants, they tend to fill labour gaps in key sectors, as we've already spoke about: healthcare, agriculture, tech, hospitality. Many new entrepreneurs are creating new businesses who are immigrants. They do pay taxes, often much higher taxes than local populations, and they do contribute towards pensions as well. Not only economic growth, but cultural enrichment as well. Food. This one always makes me laugh. Our national dish in the UK is chicken tikka masala curry, which is an Indian dish. It's literally the national dish of the UK. A lot of British families on a Friday night will either get an Indian takeout or a Chinese takeout. That wouldn't exist without immigrants. You would just have your meat and 2 veg as normal. So, you get food, you get music, art, religion, all these amazing festivals that pop up everywhere. Literature, there's so much cultural enrichment that comes from immigration. Not to mention innovation and skills. Many immigrants do bring specialised skills, and they're very well educated, and often immigrants do speak at least 2, if not 3 languages, whereas most British local people are monolingual. And they also help in science. They also contribute to science, academia, and business as well. Global links as well. Immigrant communities, they help with trade ties, with international collaboration. They act as the bridge between two countries. And countries, especially Britain, which is an island, it needs these bridges. They're very, very important for its survival, I think. And not to mention resilience and diversity as well. There's always strength in diversity. I mean, it's one of the key theories, of survival of the fittest. When you mix DNA, it becomes stronger, rather than if you have the same DNA reproducing with the same DNA, you get a lot of weaknesses and disease. Mixed communities lead to stronger, more intercultural understanding, greater tolerance, better ideas, new perspectives, and they're just generally more resilient. So immigration is not a burden. When it's done right, it's an investment. So migration and identity are deeply interwoven. Immigrants carry culture, language, memories, and societies receive those gifts, and they are gifts. And also they do sometimes challenge them. The second generation negotiates identity from both sides, and the terms that we use, immigrant and expat, they do reflect power, and they also reflect stigma as well. This stigma, this negative attitude, often stems from fear, but they obscure the real stories and the real contributions of immigrants. Businesses, economies, arts, and communities thrive through immigration. Identity is not fixed. It's a narrative in motion. You can't expect immigrants to lose all of who they are. You cannot force assimilation. You can't pretend that migration can be tidy and easy, but in embracing the complexity of it, in creating inclusive spaces, societies can benefit massively. Migration has always shaped the UK. Of course it has. We're an island. The identities we hold now are the product of centuries of movement, mixing, negotiation. And the debates around immigration are not going away. In fact, they're intensifying. But the quality of the dialogue and empathy and understanding can shift this narrative. As English learners, when you engage with immigrant stories, you're also engaging with identity and culture and power. You're not just learning vocabulary, you're encountering human lives. So let that widen your perspective. And I'll leave you with this episode with a line that I also saw in the Irish Immigrant Museum. I believe it was, when you leave the museum, the last thing you see is a sign above the exit on your way out, which says, "Everyone comes from somewhere." And I've always loved that, and it's very true. So if you've enjoyed this episode, please do subscribe. Remember, you can download the transcript and the vocabulary list from the link in the description. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do share it with someone, give it a like, drop a comment below if you've enjoyed it. If you are an immigrant or you have any stories of your own, please do let me know in the comments and we can have a chat. I'd love to hear your stories about immigration or your identity stories as well. And until next time, keep listening, keep enjoying English, keep growing, and I'll see you then. Bye.